What's up, everybody? I'm Nathan Graham Davis, and I'm going to re-break in as a Hollywood screenwriter. So it's week 17 of this whole thing, which is absolutely crazy to me. I can't believe how fast it's going by, how much I'm learning from it. If you're learning something from it, I'm not charging for this whole thing. I'm not running ads. I'm not planning to try and turn this into some sort of consulting business after it's all said and done. I just want to make movies. So if you could please do me two favors, I'd really appreciate it. One is to subscribe. My goal is to finish this whole series with a live streamed reading of the finished, polished script, and I can't do that unless I've got 1,000 of you subscribing. Two, if you could please share an episode with a friend who you think might get something out of it, or with your local writers group or community. That type of thing goes a really long way. So thank you so much for that. This week I am diving into draft 2 of my script, Ether. Last week I got notes from Jeff Willis, Christy LeBlanc, and Kristy Lowrey. You might have seen that. That was episode 16. It's pretty scary and crazy to do that on camera, but it was also awesome. I learned so much from their insight and feedback, and am very appreciative of that. Also, Martin Aguilera and Mike Morin want to extend my thanks to them because they gave me some independent feedback offline, and I was really happy that it lined up really well with what Jeff, Christy, and Kristy had to say, because that helped me really zero in on what it was that I needed to work on. So I spent the last week kind of just almost outlining again, taking lots of notes and just thinking through, character motivations and arcs and things like that. And then once I had enough to go on, I just dove right back in with a brand new document. So this is kind of a soft page 1 rewrite, basically, where I'm sure I'm going to steal some things from the last draft, maybe even copy and paste them in. But for the most part, I'm just completely starting over. I want to start fresh and just go in with this kind of blank slate frame of mind. It's more work, but yeah, it'll make for a way better draft. So I'm excited to be doing it. So this week, Kristy Lowrey's back, and we are just going to talk about rewriting and let that conversation go wherever it will. Check it out. What's up?
Hey, how are you?
How's it going? Thank you for coming back on like a week and a half, 2 weeks later. It's super cool of you. So
yeah.
So your break was good?
Yeah, it was good. I mean, didn't go anywhere. There's not many places to go, obviously. So I guess it was just more of a don't have to work kind of thing, unless a break. But it's nice to kind of, especially when you're like on a show or something, it's nice to just decompress or just take some time away. So I did that very much. So we'll see. I mean, tomorrow I got to go back to the room.
I was just going to ask when you're going to go back.
Cool. Yeah, we start back tomorrow. My episode's supposed to start shooting tomorrow, which will be interesting, obviously, given we've been on a 2-week break, and to hear and see, did we have any, because we test everyone. I think they tested everyone Saturday.
Oh man.
But they're
so
testing
like
everyone.
Could come back and completely derail that, huh?
Yeah, well, I mean, they're testing everyone pretty regularly on the sets and stuff now, but that's one thing when you're going, episodes back to back to back, and we shoot in New York, so everyone's, there and pretty quarantined in terms of their, who they're dealing with. But when you say you have 2 weeks off, and, they tell everyone not to go anywhere, but of course people probably went back home.
You're not going to be able to control everybody.
Yeah, so I think if there is a time for, something like that to happen, I mean, and some shows have been having it, happen while they're shooting, but mine being over the break is definitely, to me, the scariest. I'm like, who knows what will come back. So we'll see tomorrow. We'll hear whether we are.
Good luck. Yeah.
we're going to start
pretty
shooting.
Interesting. So it shoots in New York, but the room's in LA. Are there any on-set writers at all for the episodes at all, or like how does that work?
I think in normal years, most shows do. And I've heard a couple people going out to their shows. But with the pandemic, it's obviously one less person you have to fly across country and then get in contact people. So we are not going to set right now. What we're basically doing is like prepping through Zoom. So everyone's getting on Zoom meetings and going through the script and doing all the prep there. But we're kind of trusting our producing director and just other people who are on set every day. But I know a few shows and writers, they shoot here in LA and they've been on set, but again, they're not getting on a plane and traveling. Right. They're just getting in their car. So I think there's a lot lot less writers on set this year if I had to guess from talking to everyone, but we're definitely just it just doesn't make sense for us to go out to New York for a week or two, you know.
That's interesting. Do you think that that could at all shift like so, you know, like one of the nice things about TV is that the writers have a lot more authority over, you know, the vision, right? Like I'm
Yeah.
curious if there are less writers on set as a result of COVID, if some of that might shift permanently. Do you think that's possible?
Um, I mean, it could be. I think there are some shows I've heard, you know, just kind of depends on the show. There are some shows where the writers don't go to set, and that's either because it's, you know, been up and running, you know, maybe if it's a, you know, season 6 or 7 or 8, it's a well-oiled machine. So there's no
Right.
need
Yep.
for, you know, or you're just there as, you know, just putting in FaceTime. Whether we'll see more, I mean, I think until whatever the new normal looks like, just having less people, like I said, I imagine that'll continue into this year pretty heavily. But I don't know about just overall less, because I think there is a sense of most shows, at least most showrunners like to send their writers to have someone who either wrote the episode or just an upper level to kind of oversee the writing side of it. And it's good, you know, producer experience in terms of like set experience
Yeah.
is very different from being in the room and that kind of thing. So I think it remains to be seen, but I think we'll definitely see a scale back for at least the first half of this year. Maybe if we start getting into like whatever normal looks like, or I think it just depends on how obviously everything goes here. But
Yeah.
where everyone was talking about, you know, spring would be going back, but looking at everything now, I'm like, spring would be not a
That's
miracle, but
optimistic at this
that's
point. Yeah.
that's very, very
So
optimistic. Maybe summer, fall, maybe, yeah. But
summer seems possible. Definitely fall seems
yeah,
possible. So which
yeah.
is like
So
it's so crazy to like think of that. It's like, oh, all right, summer, I can wait till summer back. Because like back in like last March, we were all like, okay, 4 weeks of this and then we're back and it'll be okay. Like we can survive 4 weeks. It's a long time,
yeah,
but we can do it, you know. And now we're like, yeah, 6 months. I mean, it sucks, but whatever, we'll be okay. So I guess since we've been talking about TV a lot already and we're talking about rewriting, I know nothing about how rewriting works in TV at all. Like, because I mean, obviously there's less of it, I would assume, because you have to move really, really quickly. Um, but
yeah,
how
it
does that go?
depends. I mean, I think in a sense it happens, you know, just like any other rewriting. Although I would say if you have like your showrunner who is kind of, you know, the vision and the voice of the show, hopefully you're already getting close to what they want in those earlier drafts anyway. So there's
Right.
nothing, you know, you're not getting hopefully any major curveballs of like, I didn't want this or this is not fitting the story, because hopefully they are in there, whether they're in the room day to day or just, you know, checking in to make sure you're on track. Hopefully they're preventing any like major problems you would have. But there's definitely in terms of like how it works, you know, let's say you write the first draft, the room has broken it and you've all agreed on like, this is the story you're telling the episode, this is
Yep.
the order of the scenes, all that good stuff. You know, you do have to you know, you're sending it to either your production company or your studio and network, and they definitely have thoughts. And what's interesting about them, which actually I just went through this on my episode, is that, you know, we're trying to write what we think is like the showrunner's vision and voice of the show, but the studio network, they're definitely more on in terms of the business side. Like they know their audience really well, what works for their networks across all their shows, or at least if their audience, like, you know, the show I'm on's on CBS, and typically CBS skews like older audience. So knowing that, sometimes they'll give us notes that kind of like, you know, well, or their audience are like clue solvers, so like, can we make this more complicated or make this more of a mystery, because our audience is like in tune with like the mystery of the case or whatever, where sometimes, you know, we're thinking of that too, but we're also thinking, you know, characters and all this stuff. So I think they're good about knowing their demographic and what really works for their network. But so you'll definitely go through notes rounds with, like I said, sometimes they will all get together and give you a set of notes. Sometimes you're literally going, okay, production company, what are your notes? Okay, studio, what are your notes? And you're doing like multiple sets of notes. Sometimes you get writer notes, obviously, in like an early draft, what we call like a writer's draft. You're like giving it to everyone, just like, okay, you know, logic notes, anything that's like could be better. That's kind of like what would be like your vomit draft, rough draft, where you're just getting like inside feedback. And then I would say kind of the last round, hopefully, is like your production notes, because this is actually something I went through in my episode, but like I wrote and I don't think this will be a spoiler, but like a scene that took place on like a scaffolding it was going to be like an action scene. But then when you go to production, they're like, well, we can't get a location or that has scaffolding, or we can't build our own scaffolding because it's too expensive, but we have these 2 buildings that are in different tiers, so we can do that. So then you find that you're actually trying to like rewrite something that production can actually get or film. So I find a lot of the rewrites are actually for production, you know. And sometimes it's small. It's like, oh, you wrote this in a diner, but you know, we found this cool outdoor coffee shop, and it's like, okay, so you just change it. Like maybe they're not having breakfast, they're having a coffee, like some small things like that. But yeah, it's you definitely just have to think, you know, what, because I think in terms of like writing, it's, you know, we're left to our own devices. We get to imagine literally anything, especially when you're doing features, when there's no like production involved. In TV, we kind of have a sense of like, okay, well, this would be cool. But like I said, at a certain point, you have to give it to the people who are actually going to make it, which is a whole other set of things. And they try to bring you back down to earth. Like, okay, realistically, here's what we can actually do. You have to get to fit this. Or, you know, the scenes at night, can it be a day? The scenes in a club, can it be in a restaurant? Those kinds of things are just, you know, you make those sacrifices because you want to get it shot. You're not going to put your foot down and be like, no, this has to be in X location, because it's like, well, you know, they have a hard job in terms of like, we get to write it on a page and it's like, this could happen, but to actually ask people to like, you know, get all those props, get all those people together and actually do the thing, like they're doing something really amazing and hard. So I at least for me, I try to make it as simple for them as possible and compromise. Like, yeah, we can change it, you know.
I think that's super cool to recognize. And so like you had that experience from doing TV, and you probably get to see it more than a lot of feature writers would, at least early in their career.
Yeah.
Which is really cool because, I mean, first of all, if you haven't had anything produced, which is basically me, like aside from like some tiny little, you know, short type stuff, you don't have that experience of like creating something and then seeing all the challenges and actually getting that made and seeing what actually works, right? Whereas with you, like you've seen it, you've written multiple episodes and you've seen like how that plays out. And so you probably have a respect for the process that informs your writing, even when you go back to something like a spec feature that is probably really valuable.
Yeah, I think you have to. Yeah, definitely when I was doing features, even just writing my own pilots, like I said, I just do whatever you want because there's no one there. You know, you don't know if you're going to shoot it. You haven't sold it. So you're, you know, it's better to go big and do whatever. But yeah, definitely when I started getting on shows, like I said, and having to like, oh, this actually has to be, someone has to figure out how to do this. You really stop and think like, even the smallest things you would think wouldn't be a big deal in the script are like, you know, like a driving scene. It's like, well, or, you know, do we actually have a place we can drive that? Do we have a trailer? Are we going to do it on green screen? Like so yeah, you definitely start thinking. I would say though, for me, when I go back and still do my originals, I don't feel it so much because I err on the side of like, if I know it's not sold or in production, like I'm just going to do what I want. Like I'm going to dream big and do the scenes that I want to do, how I want to do them. And because really, I think your first drafts and those going forward where no one, like there's no outside force in terms of like a studio's bought it or a network or a production company, that's when you get, that's really the only time you really get to do everything that you want to do. Right. So I kind of, I cherish that a little bit and I don't restrict myself too much, but yeah, it's kind of two different worlds in a sense, in terms of writing specs and yeah, writing TV where you know something's going to get shot in a couple weeks. It's a little scary.
How many episodes have you done now that have been yours? You've got one coming up, shooting this week.
Got one start shooting tomorrow, hopefully, fingers crossed. This would be my fourth one, hopefully, to air. You know, I wrote pieces of other episodes that sometimes don't get your name on them. But yeah, this would be my fourth solo credit, actually. Hopefully
that is awesome.
Air. Yeah, no,
cool.
It's a great feeling. Yeah, to, you know, we spend all of our time, and you just like me is like we spend years and years writing these specs, and it's like you want to see your name on TV, and then the day that you like see your name on a TV or a movie screen, it's like, wow, I know there's something magical about it, and you kind of chase that. I'm curious to see if it gets like if the feeling ever changes or if it's kind of like Christmas morning every time. So far, it's still like a good feeling just to like see.
I bet.
I wrote those words. I hear them. It's kind of magical, I think, in a sense, and we all want that in a sense.
I feel like something cool about TV too, especially like network TV. So, this is on after the AFC championship game, right?
Yes, I
Um,
believe. I
or
should
that's
double
when it
check.
starts, but that's not your
Yeah.
episode.
Yeah, not my
But
episode. I think I'm early February, I
but
believe.
so like your episode airs, and like you're like sitting at home knowing like there's millions of other people watching it at the exact same time, and like that's pretty special, because even like something that goes into theaters, like it's not that same type of event type thing, so that's it's very cool.
Yeah, especially if it's airing, it's like, this is, if you're watching it live, yeah, hopefully millions of people around the country are tuning at the same time. Yeah, I've as long as I've written movies, I've yet to get one made, so I don't know how the feeling is different, but I'd like to think, if I'd love to go to a theater, like, and like sit in the
Oh
back and
man,
watch.
that
Yeah,
is
wouldn't that be
like
cool?
the vision like that I'm still chasing after all this time, is like getting to go to
Me
a theater, just
too.
kind of watch
Me too.
people hopefully enjoying the movie that I wrote. Like that's that thing that I'm chasing for sure. But
Yeah.
it's like you said, it's like, you work so long at this with nothing to show for it, and that's why I went and did that graphic novel and then kind of stayed out of it for a while and was doing other things, because I just wanted, like, I had been telling people I was a writer for like 10 years and had nothing to show for it. And it just felt so like lame,
It's the
So,
hardest thing. I mean, yeah, obviously the day I was able to go home on a holiday or to family and say, I've been saying I was a writer for years, but this, the next question you get asked is like, oh, what have you written that I've seen? It's like,
right.
and it's, and there was a certain point in which I was working on shows, but either, I was a lower level, so I wasn't either getting my own episodes, or I was like writing scenes and stuff for other people episodes. So I was seeing my stuff, but my name wasn't attached. So it's hard to say like, oh, I helped write this, or I was a part of this, because they want to see your name. So, yeah, I totally get that. It's tough, but there's so many people, especially who work on the feature side, that make a living and they never get a credit. They never get to see
It's
their name on screen, but
crazy.
they
Like,
make, yeah,
some of them make a great living too. Like,
yeah,
that's the funny thing. It's like, like they're constantly working, and you wouldn't know it if you went and looked at their IMDb credits, it's just,
it's
it's
such a
nuts.
odd business. When I talk to people obviously who work in it, it's nice when you're talking shop with people, because you understand how multifaceted it is and how complicated. But then when even when I talk to my husband or just like family, it's hard to sometimes explain to them those things. Like, I wanted to say like, no, I'm working on shows, but you're not going to be able to look up my credits, or you're not going to be able to like turn on the TV and see my name. It's hard for them to grasp like how you're making a living, or like how you're chasing, whether you're chasing a dream or not. Like, why are you doing this if you're not? But it's hard. Like, that's what everyone wants. Like, that's the apex of like getting something made, seeing your name on screen, like getting paid for writing, like all those little milestones. But honestly, the truth is like not everyone will get there, and not everyone can do it. So it is like the thing we're chasing. But I feel like persistence is, one thing. If you study the craft, or you are putting in the work ethic and all that, I believe that persistence will eventually pay off. But I see a lot of writers who don't, like, they want to be called writers, but they don't do a lot of writing, and that's
Yeah.
where I'm like, well, I don't know that you're gonna
Writers
make it very
right.
far.
Right.
Writers are right,
So,
exactly. So, and
but
look at you, you're back to writing. So I'm feeling
yeah,
good
and
about.
I've been writing the whole time, just not screenplays really for the last 6 years, with the exception of kind of one in the middle there somewhere. But I think I gained a lot from all those different writing experiences too, and all the life experience that I've had in that time. So like, although I definitely kind of regret that I got out of the game, because I think, in 6 years, maybe I could have built some momentum somewhere.
Is that how long you took a
Yeah,
time off
yeah,
from writing? 6 years. Wow, it
six,
flew
7 years. Because I parted ways with my manager in 2014. So, and then like kind of finished up a spec, tried to get new representation with that, didn't get new representation with that. Actually, that's one thing that I want to talk about today. And so I didn't get representation with that one. And then I kind of was like, well, you know what? I'm going to go do this graphic novel on this idea that I had pitched to my manager and loved, and he didn't want me to write. And so I did that, and that took 2 years. And so that went by. And then I wrote that spec, the Continuum, but didn't really do much with that. Like, a few people sent it to their reps, and it didn't go anywhere. And by that point, like, Hollywood had kind of lost some of its luster for me, and I just kept writing short stories and stuff. But now I just decided I really still want to get movies made. So back at it with everything I've got.
Yeah, I get that. You know, it's interesting. I always tell myself when I write a short story, because staffing's getting so interesting. You know, used to you had to write like a spec pilot. Well, sorry, it's like a spec episode of a show, so an existing show, and now original pilots have become a thing. But now some people are so tired of reading original pilots. Like short stories are big, and plays, which I'm not a playwright, but they love playwrights. So I don't know if any of those short stories you have, but keep those in your back pocket, because if
I
you're ever
hear that
looking
they're
to like
big
do
now, which
TV,
is interesting because I've got like
yeah.
30 or 40 of them at least, you know. So
Yeah, well, for one, they're shorter typically than scripts.
so somebody actually doesn't mind reading them.
Yeah, and for me, it's interesting because I wasn't one of those people who like started. I know a lot of people who either started with novels or started with plays or, you know, some sort of other writing prose. And I just jumped straight into screenwriting and scripts and have never really written outside of that. So sometimes I feel like I hack a little bit of like, I've learned how to, you know, I don't want to say master, obviously, because I'm not, but like do the craft of screenwriting. But like writing prose scares me because I'm like, oh, do I actually understand like actual grammar rules and those kinds of things? So I think screenwriting is a lot of it is understanding what to do and what not to do, and being efficient. Really, I read so many scripts where it's like, I don't know if people think they're like writing the novel version or they think they have all this time, but when you only have 60 pages or 100 pages, it seems like a lot, because when you're typing, it's like you're never going to get to the end, but it's really not when you have all these elements and stories and characters you need to set up. So I find that just learning, like once you kind of get down, like, you know, how a scene plays out and structure and all these things are just specific to scripts and maybe not novels. Not to say novels don't have structure, but I think you can look at scripts and say, they all have a very clear, whatever, 3-act structure, and novels can vary, you know. But just learning the craft of screenwriting, I think is super helpful, even for people who come from books. Like I've seen that, like they're great novelists and they come to screenwriting and they try to apply that same, like you're describing the grass and how it smells or whatever. And it's like, no, you don't need that. Just like give us the basic, like what we're seeing in a like interesting way and what the characters are saying, and then get out, you know.
All right,
so
hold that thought, because you
okay.
you gave me a note that you gave me a note about like how like the words that you use, right, in order to like evoke a certain atmosphere and feeling, right? And so you said that you thought it'd actually be cool to talk about that today. So let's talk about that, right? Because I think that that's so important, and I totally agree with you. And so your note had essentially been like, you know, you should really focus on how you're using the words in order to like evoke a certain atmosphere or a feeling or tone. And I think one of my challenges with this draft was that I really wasn't sure what the tone I was going for was. So that was a little bit all over the place, because I completely agree with that and am big on the same thing. And so you were just talking about how like a novelist comes in and they don't need to use all that flowery language and describe everything. So like, how do you strike that balance? How do you evoke those things in your reader with the kind of bare minimum?
You're not just describing what's happening. Sometimes, you know, you can write, you know, you open whatever, a sunset in the field and there's cows and then there's a guy in his truck. You can do that. But again, how are you doing it in an interesting way? Because what people forget is like someone has to read this. So you have to write it in a way that you are evoking emotion from or conjuring a certain image for that reader. You're not just laying out what is happening in a very dry way. Again, just, oh, we see a sunset and we see a pasture and we see a man get out of his truck. Again, if you tell 10 writers, like write some version of that, hopefully you're going to get 10 different versions, but probably 2 or 3 of them are going to be much more interesting than the rest of them. You do have to obviously explain what's happening in a clear way in terms of the visuals or the dialogue so that someone understands how the scene is unfolding. But there is a certain way you write, especially if you're writing horror. Like, well, perfect example, because you told me you read my feature, Devil Went Down to Florida, which is...
you had some examples from that. Awesome, by the way. So say the title again, just because I was talking over you.
It is called Devil Went Down to Florida, which is a play on the Charlie Daniels song, Devil Went Down to Georgia, obviously. It was based on a short story that a author I'd found written, and so I optioned it from him. I just thought it was actually based on a true story, and I just thought it was a great story.
Wow.
But we'll talk about that later. But you know, that had a sense of like very grounded, but then there was kind of, and I'm curious to hear what you think, but was supposed to be this kind of unease building until you kind of reach these like horror, supernatural elements. And what I tried to do in thinking about that, like I was very conscious about how I wrote that up front. I wanted you to believe it was super grounded, like this. You were just stepping into someone's ordinary life. There was no hints of a supernatural horror thing. But then, you know, when an owl shows up in the middle of the day, it's like, well, that's not too weird, right? You see owls, and then, but then it starts following you, and just like,
Right.
But also in how you write that in terms of like, this is always tricky because now you're getting into like voice and style, but again, pacing, like we talk about Bird Box, like very quick staccato things, like you're reading it with a quick pace and you don't realize it, but like maybe you're getting your like heart rate going a little bit because you're like, you want to follow that down the page and you're like, well, what's going to happen next? Oh, I'm seeing this thing, or there's something unsettling about it. So is it just literally how you're laying it out on the page? Like people don't realize how important pacing is. Again, those very quick staccato words. Yeah. Are you pulling someone down the page? Are you drawing something out? You know, even in Devil, I played with size of fonts. And I know we're getting into more like advanced things or whether like the rules are actually the rules, but you know, if I can put one word, and one word, maybe that's not what you learned in your screenwriting class. But again, am I pulling you down the page? Are you wanting to see what happens next? Are you wanting to see if that character is a good guy or a bad guy, or wanting to know, is that owl really following him, or is it just some owl he's seeing, you know? But again, we don't realize the words that we're typing they're doing so much more than creating a visual. Again, it's feeling, it's atmosphere, it's environment. It's just all these things that's why I think screenwriting is actually so hard. So I think when I meant that in terms of like your horror moments, you don't have to do every scene that way, but obviously the more interesting you can write that, and in terms of pacing of it, pulling us down the page. And when you get to those moments that are going to edge into horror, you know, are you drawing out sounds? Like if it's a screech, is it, you know, do you literally write it SCREE, you know, CH? And it's like this is interesting. I'm trying to think of am I making any sense to you, Nate?
Oh, you totally
Does this
are.
make sense to someone? I'm trying to think of
yeah. So like one thing that you had said, one thing that you said, like in those notes along with it, like, so you asked like if I was against capitalizing words and things like that, right? And actually, if you read any of my other scripts, they're full of word art, right? Like, I mean, there's caps and underlines and bolds and different font sizes and all that. And in this one, I specifically didn't do that because I wanted it to feel more of like a grounded, slow burn. But I think, as you had all pointed out, I was kind of scattered on that, right? Like, I mean, I had different tones and I was trying different things and they weren't quite clicking and working. So one thing that's happening with this new draft is I'm still not making it a straight horror movie, but it's definitely leaning more into that. And I'm scaling back. Christie LeBlanc had mentioned like there was an adventure element to it that I'm kind of scaling back. Like I think like I had too many different directions. So it's still got this kind of dark fantasy horror thing going. There's still a dramatic story as a through line, but it's definitely leaning more into the darker side of things. And so, you know, the language is coming out. How much am I going to capitalize? I don't know. I'm like 10 pages into the new first act right now. So I haven't done a whole lot of that yet, but it's still just ramping up.
I think you're doing exactly what I would be doing. And like I said, and I don't write necessarily straight horror. I mean, I would say Devil would be the closest thing that I've strayed into like genre. But like I said, I started very grounded. But I think if there is a genre that lends itself to like stylistic writing, it is thrillers and horrors. Because again, how are you using either whether it's the literal words themselves, capitalizing, any sort of like craft trickery in a sense. Like the reader needs to feel something, or they're just flipping through the pages, like reading, okay, but they need to feel, you know, is the moment tense? They need to feel that. Is it an exciting moment? They need to feel that. So however you're doing that with your wording and how you're laying it out on the page, like that is almost just as important sometimes as like the imagery and the words you're putting on the page, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think that's a great point. So, you know, hopefully people take something away from that. Like, for this one, I mean, where it's going now, I don't necessarily want people to feel scared and terrified too much. Like there'll be a couple moments, but for the most part, I really just want it to be I want there to be a lot of feelings of unease and just unsettling, right? And not,
Yeah, and I would say the unsettling feeling, you know, which is kind of a harder thing to achieve in a sense because you're having to track, you know, what is the reader, and we can talk about this in terms of like a larger macro subject. I think I mentioned I wanted to talk about considering the reader, but so just tracking, you know, what are they feeling at every moment? Because again, if you're in a very grounded moment, but you just throw in one thing that seems a little off, but it's big enough for your reader to notice, they may go like that, huh, interesting.
okay,
But then they may
that's
think
cool.
nothing about it, but it's like something about whether it's a piece of dialogue or just something a character does, it's like odd, or they are unsettling themselves. If you can write in a way where your reader goes like they know you're going to come back to that, they don't know how it's going to play out, but it's like, huh, that was weird, and then you just build on it next time, and it basically is culminating into whatever moment. You have to seed that and drag them along the story you're telling. Again, you're manipulating them as you go. So however you want to do that, uh, just find that moment of like what starts to unsettle them and how do I build on that and what does it culminate to, if it does, or do you just leave them in suspense for a moment and then boom, on the next page you hit them with something big, and it's, it gets so, I think, complicated, but in a good way. But again, you just need to track, like, what does a reader think at this moment when I throw this in? What are they thinking? What are they thinking? Because it's really, I know as writers, we typically write for ourselves, and you should be writing for yourself. But again, this is what I call considering the reader. You're writing it for someone else to read. So you can't just write everything again, just because you know it. That's one thing but you're having to lay it out in a meaningful but also very purposeful way. Like Craig Mazin talks about this when they talk about your opening pages, but like every word sometimes is painstakingly picked, or there's a line break, or the pacing of it. It's all very purposeful. You may not realize it on the page, but when you set 3 or 4 pages, if you took an amateur script and a pro script, you can tell within the first few lines which one is in command of their craft and which one isn't. And it's because one is thought through all these things. What is the reader thinking when they literally read the first 4 lines of my script? What imagery are they seeing? Are they getting the tone, the genre? Like, you're getting all that hopefully in the first page, whether as like more of an amateur, if you realize they're doing that or not. They know what they're doing. So I think you just have to keep all those things in mind while you're also trying to set up, and rewrite your story. It's like, yes, you have to have your action and dialogue and all the things your characters can do, but what are those extra things that like you can layer in there that speaks to tone, speaks to pacing, speaks to atmosphere, and all those things.
That's super cool. Yeah, and like, although I still that am crossing genres a little bit, what was really helpful was just understanding that I needed to both really nail down my tone and also really make it crystal clear from the start what Scara's motivations were, right?
Yeah.
And so, that has really helped. And these first 10 pages that I've got now, they feel so much stronger. So I'm super excited about them. Like, I'm not going to bore you with everything, but the opening image is now way different. Do you remember, like, this was probably about page 10 to 12. She walked by this like body on a breaking wheel. So there was this, for anybody who doesn't know what a breaking wheel is, basically it's like this big wooden wheel of spokes, and they would actually break people's limbs and weave them through the spokes and then tie them to it and leave them there to die. And so the movie's actually going to open on like the lips of somebody on a breaking wheel, like breathing out their last breath, basically. And then they're there, and we realize it's a woman because she's nude. And that's the only reason that you can recognize that she's a woman. She's just that mutilated. And in front of her is a sign that says witch in Old Norse. And like, there'll be like a super that says witch. And then like, it'll cut to the inside of a church and go from there. But
I think that's great. I was literally thinking, I was like, I hope he's going where I think he's going with that. And what that does is sets up, especially once we figure out like what Scara is doing and her motivation. And for one, that she's is a witch or is looking to dabble in that. It's like, you've already set up your stakes and what the world thinks about people like her,
exactly,
which immediately just makes everything, it just sets an underlying either tension, stakes, or if she's found out by anyone, like, this is what could happen. So that's great. I love that.
So yeah, I mean, it's and what's cool is the process of like kind of nailing the tone also actually helped me zero in on her as a character better. Like I do feel like I already understand her, so like I can visualize this person so much better than I could on that first draft, just 10 pages into it. So it's still,
Yeah.
it's a massive rewrite for sure, but
And I think you'll find would you say your first draft was, do you do vomit drafts? Would you say it was just a rough first draft? Like what would you have called that?
Like
Okay.
I don't know if it's fair to call my first drafts vomit drafts, because I'm probably a little more finicky than that. But I mean, I was churning out 20 pages a week, so it wasn't, really slow.
Yeah,
Especially
you didn't
like
comb
with the day
over,
job and
yeah.
everything. Right.
Yeah.
I didn't go back and retweak stuff, right? Like I would like write and then maybe look through like the last page when I sat down and then just keep going. Like I would never reread everything until I finished the whole draft. And then I kind of spent a week going through that, cleaning it up.
Yeah. That's how I do it. I still consider it a little bit of a vomit draft just because you're not going back. You're essentially, whether you're spending, 5 pages a day, but and there are people who do go back every time and retweak. And I find that's fine. I used to do that, but I like to just push through and go with my natural inclinations or my gut in the first round. Cause I think some of that stuff will stay, or there's something you can find in it that's raw and you'll keep around. I was just curious if you had like combed over that, if you kind of considered that a rougher draft.
Well, to be perfectly honest, I normally do more rereading, and the reason that I didn't is because I set this like very public deadline of what I needed to have the script done, and so I needed to stay on track with it. So, but it worked great. I mean, I had the script done exactly when I said it was going to be done, and I'm still fairly on track with it. So
I think you'll find if you do it that way as I do, is you sometimes you think where your characters are and you do have a sense of it, but then definitely when you get notes and you have to go back and start thinking of certain elements, my character, what do they want, then you start seeing them more clearly every single draft.
Yes, like I understand Scaris so much better now already. I'm interested to see if I get to the same place with Valdala as I'm writing out her new pages. But I'm super excited by it. I think it's really interesting. So like we all say writing is rewriting, right? Like that's such a common phrase. If you haven't heard that, you're an incredibly new writer. But like all of the conversation and all of the resources and stuff that we see are very focused on that first draft, right? Like there's so little on rewriting, and I wonder why that is, since like that's really like the rewrites are usually more than half of the overall work, you know.
I will say I remember when I first started writing, my first year I wrote 6 full-length feature screenplays completed.
Holy
which is
shit,
absurd.
in 1 year.
In 1
I've
year
never done anything close to that. I think like 2.5 or 3. Like,
so we met on Dundale Pro, right? Or we met online.
Yeah, you were like Ducky something.
Yeah. That first year I started writing in that script you wrote, Tony, I had written 6 completed screenplays. And part of the reason was, well, for one, I was learning, but also I didn't know how to rewrite. Like I didn't understand, aside from going through my script and like tweaking dialogue, which by the way, I want to look at the camera directly, which is not rewriting. It is rewriting when you're like polishing and you've done like multiple drafts and you're just tweaking dialogue. Yes. But part of that is because for one, you're right. No resources, no one talks about, but like, how do you, even when people are telling you what's wrong with your script, like where do you even start? Because you already feel like, man, I wrote 100 pages. I did this really great thing. Someone should give me a trophy, right? And only to realize like you're not even halfway through the race or whatever.
Right.
Which is great. Luckily why we're talking about this, or you're doing this, because I think rewriting is where you're doing. I can think of a lot of scripts I've written, and I've had maybe like 1 or 2 where they've stayed fairly intact from the first draft. I would say those are like anomaly zone. Every now and then you'll get that one story that somehow you just managed to like, get close on the first try. But I've also had multiple pilots and scripts in Devil as well. I've done like multiple page 1 rewrites, which is like literally kind of throwing out everything and starting from scratch. But I think that's part of it, because we're a little precious about things, and it's also hard to see, like, even if you know the problems, it's like a car. My husband works on cars. It's like, well, if you tell me, okay, well, it's got a oil leak, okay, I understand that, but I don't know where do I start in trying, okay, I've diagnosed it, but like actually trying to fix it. And a script is no different. I think when you say like your character has no motivation, it's like, okay, well, just to be able to take that one strand and that one element out and figure out, or does that pulling on that strand then like unravel like your structure and doesn't
Right.
unravel your story? Like
Well,
it
and
gets very precarious.
That's why this rewrite is so big, right? Like you all had said, and I also got notes from Martin Aguilera and Mike Morin independently because I was curious if they might be different since we were all talking in a group. And
Sure.
really cool is that they weren't. Like everybody was basically on the same page.
Which is good for you. Yeah.
It's great, right? That's what you want. Like if you're getting consistent notes, you have a really clear target, and that's just awesome. But everybody was kind of like, I don't think you have a page one rewrite. Definitely a lot of work to do, but like, you got the pieces there. But as I was thinking through it, like I realized like I had to take things in a massively different direction in order to kind of achieve the same end result of the story that I wanted. Like if I wanted to get the audience to the same place that had been my vision to begin with, I was going to have to change a lot in order to address those notes. And so it just is what it is. Like I'm the entire first act is going out. I'm changing major elements of the story. Most of the second act is gone. It's big, but it's okay. Like,
yeah, I mean, I think you're doing exactly what I would be doing, which is, first after I write kind of a first draft, or I've kind of gone through it where it feels like it's readable, I will send it to usually like 3 to 5 people. And to me, that's just a good number of, maybe not everyone's going to read, but to for one, understand like what is everyone feeling when they're reading this, because again, we write it and we think we know, but when you give it to someone fresh or someone who doesn't know the story, they're going to have a lot of thoughts on it. So I'll usually take those 3 to 5 notes and then I compare them, because if 3 of the 5 people have the same note, I'm like, well, that's probably a problem. If one of those 5 people has an issue with like characters unlikable or whatever, I'm like, well, I'll take a look at it for sure and just see, or was it one spot, so it sounds like you've gotten, from everyone, here's my, handful of larger issues maybe I need to address, in which it sounds like you're tearing it apart. I would then take those. Usually depends on how big the rewrite is. It sounds like you're doing a pretty big one. Yeah, maybe not a page one, but I like to then just like redigest again. What is the story I think I'm trying to tell? What is it I'm trying to achieve? Like, but think of it, you can't think of the old version. You always kind of have to throw that version out of your mind in a sense, and kind of rebuild it from scratch, I guess. But if it's something like a pilot or like with Devil, because certain scenes had to come in a certain order, sometimes I would just re-outline it.
What you just said about needing to throw the old version out, that's why, even though I would call this a soft page one rewrite, where, I'm going to change 60 to 70% of it. I'm starting with a brand new document and just writing from scratch. Right. And that's why, is because I need to just let go of that old version of the story. And if I can copy and paste stuff and pull it in later, I will, but I'm writing from scratch.
I think sometimes the death of rewriting is not doing that. Like I said, if you have very minor rewrites, yes, it's fine to like open your existing file, save it as something else, and just make some changes with them. But in terms of the rewrite you're doing, and a lot of the rewrites you're doing early on, even, if I'm doing, even when I'm doing smaller rewrites, I tend to just start with a blank page anyways, because again, it's just easier for me to erase my mind. Don't think about the last draft, only think about, I know what my story is. I know where I'm wanting to go. I mentally, I think I've fixed the problems or how to get there. But now you need to actually, again, consider the reader and track it when you lay in the first page. Okay, is this achieving what I want? So when you do those first 5 to 10 pages, like I said, it sounds like you have a great like opening image and all that, and stakes. Like I said, I think that immediately kind of sets like the danger of your world right up at the top. But so you start asking yourself, okay, is it clear? Am I going to be getting into Scara's motivation and what she's doing here? Is the tone clear? If the tone should be clear, and then should it feel like the genre, again, because of the way I've done my stuff in the past, you may not need to know the genre right up front, but you need to get a sense of like, if it does feel really grounded, like something probably in the first at least like 15 pages, like there's something that kind of like shoots to that horror thing, like just even if it's small, but you're starting with a horror image, so you kind of have that essentially. And then
something big and magical will happen on like page 12 to 14 and dark. And that's gonna like send everything kind of reeling in a completely other direction, and kind of and that's what's gonna force her toward Valdella's place.
Yeah, so
So
it seems
yeah, I
like
mean, it's
you're on the right track, or at least how I would do it. Like I said, when I'm doing those
it's
larger
more of a
rewrites,
traditional
yeah,
catalyst, you know. So I had
yeah.
tried to see if I could get away with skipping the catalyst essentially and starting after it. And at least for this story, I don't think it worked that well.
You know, it's
So
hard. Anyone who tries to do, and I used to try to write some of these early on. Like we all had this thing. We watch these movies, and sometimes it feels like a slow burn. And we're like, oh, that's cool. Where it's like, but then when you try to
yeah,
write it, sometimes it can fall flat. And I've gotten to where like a lot of my more successful scripts or pilots typically like within the first like 7 or less pages, I've gotten to like where my pilot I just wrote with like page 4, I have a big event, but there is something about just like being able to capitalize on momentum because you know these execs and anyone who's in the business has read a lot of scripts. They've read a lot of first pages. They've read a lot of first 5 pages, a lot of
hmm
first 10 pages, and there's nothing worse than reading like a not only a boring script, but you know a lot of these scripts because they're coming from pro writers or even you know people who are on the just pre-pro or however you want to put it. Um, they're just fine or they're just okay. They're competent and you can read them and you can get through them. But remember, you're competing against, in a sense, like the best
hmm
in this business, and cream rises to the top. So you need to always be remembering, like, I have to be, in a sense, better than everyone. That's not meant to be competitive, but it is. You know, again, if they're reading 100 scripts a month, you need to be one of those like top 10% they're remembering. I think
right.
about staffing when I used to be on an assistant on the show. We literally got like 200 scripts to fill like 2 or 3 slots. And we were just reading through them. And it's again, when I get to the end of my pile or the end of the day, I'm like, okay, well, which ones stood out to me? Which ones grabbed me right away? If you can grab someone right away, it'll buy you a lot of time in the middle where things tend to, if they're going to slump in like act 2 or like feel a little bit of a lull, if you've done something to like make them sit up a little straighter in the first act, that can carry you through some of those moments.
Yeah.
But if you're just asking a reader, just wait. I have this saying I use whenever I was interning, but it's perception over intention, and it's whatever is on the page and whatever that exec or that reader is perceiving is better than what is more important than what you intended, because you're not over their shoulder going, okay, if you just wait to page 50, something's going to happen. You just keep
Right. Right.
reading. I just hear so many writers, you're like, well, what I intended was, I was like, it kind of doesn't matter, because unless I perceived it that way, it doesn't matter what you intended. Unless I can
Right.
read it
Right.
on my own on the page and get that, it's meaningless, unfortunately. So, but yeah, I think everything you're doing is what I would do in terms of new draft. What are my largest notes? You know, I may look at some of the medium notes, but especially if I'm doing a larger rewrite, I look at those 3 to 4 big ones, usually like structure, character, yeah, motivation, all those things, tone, genre. And I really focus on those. And then when I do my next draft, you know what, you may drop the ball on some smaller things, but hopefully with every draft, your notes are getting smaller and more manageable. So maybe next time you're
Right.
getting like these medium-sized notes, but you can maybe even like work within the draft, or like, oh, the story point doesn't make sense logically, but then you make it work logically, but you're not having to throw out like complete like first acts and things like that, you know,
Totally.
things like that.
Yeah, it's funny with this draft, although actually every, you know, note definitely had its place in certainly getting me to think more about the story and how I wanted to approach it, or even just kind of like, oh yeah, I should have thought of that and I'll keep that in mind next time. A lot of the smaller notes don't even apply now because I'm throwing out so much of the script, you
Yeah.
know. And so where I would normally, for a kind of small to medium level rewrite, I would really organize all those thoughts and make sure I was going through them kind of step by step. I'm not doing that at all with this one. I mean, instead,
Yeah.
what I did was I spent a week just, I mean, you said you kind of re-outline, right? Sometimes, and I didn't
Yeah.
do kind of
Yeah.
a official outline, but what I did do was I kind of created a new scratch document and just wrote down like 5 pages of ideas, essentially just bullet pointed, you know, really, really focusing on motivation and theme and things like that. And just in following the character arcs,
Yeah.
and what those would look like going through the script. And then once I felt like I really understood that, then I felt like I was ready to dive back into pages, which was yesterday. So
Yeah, no, it's great. I think there is a sense, especially when you're getting larger notes, not only do you have to, as a writer, like digest them because it is a little bit of a shock to your system because, you know, this is the first draft you're going to get this is going to be the hardest rewrite, I imagine, because you're throwing out so much and it is a little bit more heavy lifting from the start, but you have all the elements there. You just need to pull them in when you need them, or now you maybe understand your story a little bit better. Like,
Yeah.
you know, from a macro sense of like you narrowed it down. Okay, now I can focus on Scarra's motivation and why she's going to this town and what's at stake for her, and what her dynamic is when she meets Valdal. Like all those things, it just becomes clearer with each draft. So I think you're in a good spot.
Cool. Well, that's good to hear. Good. It feels good. It really does. Like I'm super excited about these first 10 pages. Not to say that they're perfect or anything, but they already feel really just, they feel more engaging, honestly. Like I'm more excited by them, which is cool. And I think the best thing is that I really feel like I can visualize Scarra better, which is awesome. Because that's what you want, right? Like you want a really well-defined character. So she's getting closer. I'm definitely not at a point anymore where I'm like precious with first drafts. Like anytime I write a first draft, I'm just very well aware that it is going to be quite different from whatever the final version is, right? But something that I've been realizing as I've been going through this process of doing all this series and talking to people about, their process and whatnot, is I realize I call scripts done after 4 or 5 drafts usually. And sometimes they are, but sometimes they definitely aren't, right? And I think maybe I'm realizing that I do get precious at a certain point, and I'm like, all right, I've done so much work at this point, it's got to be good. And I kind of convince myself that it's done maybe when it's not. And that was the case with that script Lucid that I was talking about earlier. Mm-hmm. So I wrote that back in 2014. I did 1 draft for my manager. I had already started writing it when he repped me. And then I kind of stopped because we started working on some other things. I got back to it, finished it. He wasn't into it at all, didn't even want to develop it. And so I kind of like left it again for a little while. Then we parted ways and I did, a few more drafts on it. And I think I did a total of 4. And then I queried on it, trying to find a new rep, and had 0 offers, and was super frustrated by that. But honestly, like having reread it, it wasn't ready, like it definitely, like there were some things about it that were working really well. But it was not there. And so, how do you approach that type of thing? Like, do you have ways to kind of trick yourself into continuing to push yourself and figure out when it's ready and when it's not?
We all want to write a great script every time. But the truth is, even when you're doing this as a living or you're a pro, not every script will be great or lives up to your standards. So I think you do the best you can and you try to write, but you do just reach a certain point in which you've done all you can do, or you don't realize it, but you've either lost the magic or you've lost what makes that script. You never really know why someone responds to a script. Like I wrote a Western that's gotten me most of my TV jobs. Funny enough, my reps, when I told them, my dad was a huge John Wayne fan, and I used to hate Westerns growing up. So I wrote this thing as like since I hate Westerns so much, if I'm going to write a Western, what's the type of Western I would like? My reps are like, don't write a Western. Nobody buys them, blah, blah, blah. And they're right. Nobody does buy Westerns. But I wrote that and they loved it. And it's gotten me, it's probably got me hundreds of meetings at this point, but it's gotten me almost every staffing job I've ever had. And like jobs that like 12 Monkeys is a time travel sci-fi. I got hired on the Western. FBI got hired on a Western. Like this is like not a script that you would go like, oh, you can write a network procedural. But I've written scripts that are, again, from a craft level, very sound. But there's a specialness to like great scripts that you can't quantify. And if you ask those people, like I said, what's interesting about the Western, I wrote that first draft in 8 days.
Wow.
And I didn't rewrite a lot. That's one that stayed pretty much intact. And then there's some I've slaved over, so Devil, I just went back while you're talking about that. I went and checked my file of how many different.
I was going to ask you.
16 different files, which suggests roughly 16 drafts. Wow. And you know what? I haven't sold it. I love it. I still think there's something to do with it and I'll keep pushing it. So it's kind of like the ones you like, sometimes you're like, this is the one I'm gonna spend all my time, like I figured this one out. And then sometimes it's the one you're like, I've been wanting to talk about this topic for 20 years and here's my chance, and I'm just going to like go balls to the wall and just do what I want and not care what anyone thinks. At least for me, those tend to work out better in terms of like my career in the long run than the ones I've like somehow like slaved over and like figured out every part. But that's why writing's hard, right? Like we never know which one is like the story like, that's going to pop.
You know? That's the funny thing about either that I'm writing right now is like when I initially started this project, right? Like I was going to write the most commercial script I could because I wanted to break back in doing this project, right?
Sure.
And I got pushed by people to really focus on passion, and I'm so glad I did. You know, I'm really excited to be writing this thing. I feel good about it, but I don't know how commercial it is. It's a fucking period piece, you know? Like, but I hope that like, you know, when it's finished, there'll be something about it that like at least people can latch onto that, and it gets me, you know, meetings and in rooms and gets conversations going. And if it can do that, then that's great. Because at the end of the day, it's like it's one script in a sea of scripts that I'm gonna write, right? Like it's not the only story that I'm ever gonna put out there. And if people love this and something and it does sell somehow, awesome. But if it connects me with a bunch of people and gets conversations going, that's also great, you know? So
yeah, I find that this business is more of a business of outliers. Some of it's just standing out apart again from the thousands of other writers that are already in this business and the thousands of writers who are trying to break in. Just having that unique perspective and voice and story that like I guess no one's ever seen. So it's kind of also just that, what's your weird, unique thing that you want to do that no one else is going to do? You got to tell the stories that you believe no one else is going to tell, or else like what are we all doing here, right?
I think that's great.
Yeah, right. So for everyone, I mean, I know you have people watching this, but like you can chase the high concepts and you can chase the things you've seen, and that's fine maybe to get started, but at a certain point you need to start saying, well, as a filmmaker, as a writer, what am I offering to this industry or to this world that no one else is going to? Only I can tell this story. And that's kind of how I look at my passion projects. I'm like, I know I can do this in the very specific tone and the very specific vision I want to do. And usually those have worked out for me. So that's kind of what I've been running with these last few years. And it's worked.
That's awesome.
I think, for the most part, yeah.
So,
but sorry, got off topic.
No,
rewriting.
That's awesome. But I think that's so important, though, right? Like, to focus on like the stories that only you can tell, because otherwise, what's the point? And I think that it's really easy to get distracted from that.
And if you're not still excited and passionate about making it work, that's going to bleed over into the rewriting. So if you're just going through and like looking at the notes and going, well, I need to, you know, make this character more likable, and you're just kind of going through the motions, it's going to show on the page, and you're going to find that your script is not getting to the level you need to, or maybe it's that it needs deeper rewrites than even what you're being told or what you're willing to do. And if you kind of find yourself like, I'm over this project, or like dreading doing the rewrite, maybe that tells you that like, again, you just need to either take some time away from it or rethink it completely, or just say, hey, you know what, this was a good learning project. Maybe it's not going to be the one that I get there that's readable. Or you just send it out to the world if you don't have reps, and you let people tell you like, hey, this is not good enough or whatever. And then that kind of tells you like, okay, maybe I just need to move on to the next one. Because again, sometimes you don't feel excited, you don't feel passionate, and you have to stop and ask yourself, like, what does that really mean? What am I really trying to tell myself? Because you won't believe how much that, at least for me, and I've heard this from a lot of writers, of how much that translates on the page.
So not just passion and excitement about like the premise itself, but like you should have some of that through every single draft that you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, just the overall sense of story, like the excitement of like making it better. Usually a lot of people hate notes, and like I don't like notes in terms of like people telling me what's wrong with something, but there's an excitement of like, making things better. Like, oh, this scene could be better, the sequence could be better, or that's a better idea that they gave me. There's something exciting to me about like, again, doing that carving, like making something more defined and more specific. and just wanting to make something the best it could be. Yeah. But
well, Kristy, thank you so much for all your time and support and help. It is so much appreciated. Like, for sure, this script is going to be better because of your help with it. So thank you for that.
Well, I would love to check out the next draft, just because I read the first draft.
Do you want to check out the next draft? I try not to, like, put people through that, but if you really want to check it out, I'll definitely send it your way.
Send it to me. Who knows what I'll be doing, but I would definitely be curious to see kind of like what the changes you've made, and who knows, maybe there's a third part to the series where I come back, and if I read a second draft, we can
definitely do that, if you've got the bandwidth. So but hey, all the best with your episode. Crossing my fingers that's shooting tomorrow and everything goes as planned, and hopefully. Looking forward to seeing that when it's released. So cool.
Thank you.
Have a great rest of your day.
All right. Bye, Nate. Thank you.
So how awesome was that? I know that Kristy says that she's not necessarily a master of the craft, but I think that you could definitely make an argument that if she's not there yet, she's pretty damn close. I mean, her writing is awesome. And then on top of that, she just has great insights about the craft. The way that she thinks about it, it's pure gold. So I was super glad to be able to have these conversations with her and to get her feedback on my work. And we actually continued this conversation after we logged off a little bit, just kind of messaging back and forth. And I sent her a screenshot of the first page of the new draft of Ether. I'll scroll through that for you real quick just so that you can see it. You can pause it if you really care to take a look. You'll see that it's a lot different than, the first page of the last draft if you took a look at that. And just like I do, she thought it was on track to be much, much stronger. I feel really good about this page, actually. I'm psyched about it. But she had one little note, and it's very little. It's super minor. Like, it's the type of note that writers usually don't give each other because it's so minor and it plays into style a little bit. But because of the conversation that we had, she felt comfortable sharing it, and I'm so glad she did because I'm going to use it. I think it's super cool. So you'll see that I opened with 3 lines, like lips, eyes, limbs, right? All followed by kind of an explanation of what I was talking about. I thought that was a cool and visual and just kind of interesting, hooky way to open this thing. And I still think it is. But she pointed out that when she read the word lips, her mind thought of kind of a full set of lips before it caught up and realized what they actually looked like. So her suggestion was simply to change it to cracked lips. So I haven't done this yet. I'm just going to do it on camera now because I thought it was so cool. But I'm pretty sure she's right. So change it to cracked lips. And then I'm just changing this to scabbed. So cracked lips, scabbed and leaking a thin breath of air. There aren't many more left behind it. I do think that works way better. And so I'm going to do the same thing with the next 2 lines. So instead of eyes, closed and blood-streaked and swollen, no will left to open them, it's going to become closed eyes. Closed eyes, blood-streaked and swollen, no will left to open them. Again, I think it's stronger. So we'll do the same with that last one. Mangled limbs, broken and woven like wicker through the spokes of a giant wheel. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's awesome. So little note. It's the type of note that writers don't even usually give each other, like I said, but it's a super cool one, and I'm so glad that she shared it. So I hope you got something out of that as well. If you think it's cool, go find Kristy on Twitter and let her know, because I thought it was really helpful. Like normal, I'm giving away a copy of Malice and Mistletoe, signed by myself and by Jack Purcell. If you want a shot at winning this week's copy, I will admit I'm a little concerned that I'm not going to hit this 1,000 subscriber mark that I need to live stream the final episode of this series. So I could really use your help with that. If you could please retweet the tweet that I'm going to send out for this episode, I will pick one of you and send a copy of Malice and Mistletoe your way. Just make sure your DMs are open so that I can actually get in touch with you about it and find out what your address is. So that's what I've got for week 17. Thank you so much for checking these out. I really appreciate the support. I wish you all the best with your writing and a very happy new year. Smash cut to black.